Today I'm going to show you a snapshot of some of the books I'm reading at the moment. A question that I get asked frequently is whether it's okay to read multiple books simultaneously. Is it okay to read books quickly? Is it okay to tear through books if we're enjoying them? And I suppose it's testament to just how vocal an advocate I am for deep, slow reading and rereading that many think that I am a monogamous reader when, of course, I am anything but. One of my favourite things to do in the evening is to surround myself with a pile of books, and what I'll do is I'll pick up one book, read through it for 5-10 minutes, then I'll put it down, pick up another book, return to that book, pick up another book, and I can go through maybe 10 or 15 different books in the space of an hour or two in this fashion, and I absolutely love it. Now, this is a style of reading that I've always been really fond of. Yes, I have had those books that I focus on, that I deep read, that I read over the long term, and those are my main book, the main book on the go, and it's usually a very weighty one. It's usually a book that affords many off-roads and rabbit holes, so when I sit with a pile of books around me, those books are typically rabbit holes leading off from the main big read. But this is definitely a style of reading that I have always favoured. I've never really been able to read one book at the time. Now and then a really special book will come along and I will force myself to be faithful to it. I will force myself to be a monogamous reader, but that's definitely the exception and not the rule. I've always loved dipping into several books across the span of a single sitting, and this was a love that only deepened over the course of the last few years. Thanks to great literature and thanks to this reading approach, I was able to travel all over the world. I was able to travel back in time, and I was able to meet many interesting people who would go on to be my friends. Yes, I'm talking about great literature, I'm talking about characters. My reading over the last couple of years ended up being the most immersive style of reading that I have ever undertaken, and it has only deepened and become more robust and become something that I'm all the more passionate about. Today, with each and every passing day, I double down on this style of reading. Now, when people ask if it's okay to read multiple books, and if it's okay to read books quickly, well, the first thing I find is that many monogamous readers who come to the Hardcore Literature Book Club, even though we talk at length about reading deeply and reading slowly and rereading, a knock-on effect of being a member of the club is you suddenly cease to be a monogamous reader and you suddenly find yourself compelled to read multiple books at the same time, whether that looks like one novel and a book of poetry, a book of short stories and a book of essays, or whether that means several novels at the same time, which is slightly more difficult. That's an effect that I've noticed, and my answer to the question, is it okay, is, well, of course it's okay, so long as you are finding the experience to be rewarding and nourishing. There are many different analogies we can talk about when we discuss reading. We can talk about gear shifts. Now, some books we might be reading very, very slowly over the course of a year. That's a slow gear shift, and we must make sure that we choose those books very wisely, because very often everything else scaffolds onto that book. But of course, we can shift gears. We might read a short story, we might read a play by William Shakespeare in a single sitting very, very swiftly. We might read the same couple of poems multiple times over the course of many weeks. There's different gear shifts for different purposes. And I might deploy a travel analogy too, because I find those to be particularly illustrative. When you go traveling, you might find yourself spending more time in one location than others. Yes, you might go on side journeys, you might find yourself taking a day trip away from the main location, but you return to that central location. You try to find out what makes the locals tick. And for those hardened veteran nomads, you might find yourself trying to ingratiate yourself as one of the citizens, as one of the residents of that town or that city, and you'll find yourself learning all about that location. I personally love the approach of having one big book that you read deeply, that you journal around, that you explore in depth, but also treating yourself around the reading of that book, treating yourself to many different literary offshoots, exploring different avenues, looking things up, maybe using that book as leverage into other artistic traditions too. I think one of the reasons why people have this idea that I'm a monogamous reader is because I'm very vocal about not using quantity as your measure of success. There are many areas online where quantity is the first, foremost, and perhaps only measure of success when it comes to reading, and I've done that reading approach. I've done the TBR approach. I've done the challenge where you have 100, 150, 200 books per year, and what happens is you find yourself, when you're reading a book, always thinking about the next book, and the book before you goes unappreciated, it goes right over your head, and you don't even remember it. And I found that to be a really disheartening experience. It wasn't fulfilling, and as the way we do anything is how we do everything, I started to be rather haunted by the implications that would have in other domains of my life. Not being able to enjoy the present moment, not being able to feel a sense of peace and stillness, not being able to ground yourself and appreciate the here and now is not fun, to put it mildly. And this has only gotten worse in recent years with our fast digital culture. We're always thinking about where the next hit is coming from. We're dopamine and serotonin addicts, and we're always thinking, what's next, what's next, what's next to be achieved and ticked off, and we miss the here and now. So when my reading looked like that, ticking things off a list, I decided that the only way I could reconnect with my love of literature was to embrace a slower pace and pivot into depth and rereading, reading aloud, slowing down, writing around what I read. And after I did that, after I made that decision, I never looked back. And each and every year since then, my reading has become more and more fulfilling. But that aside, I would very much like to share with you today some of the books that I'm dipping into. Now, the reason why there are so many books here is because many of them are rereads, and a reread is easier to get through than a book you are reading for the first time. And some of these books are being read in a more scattered approach. Maybe I know exactly what I'm looking for. I don't read it from start to finish. I dip into specific chapters. And of course, any book that is on the hardcore literature schedule is a book that I'm giving the deepest reading to. When one needs to plan and put together a series of lectures around a book, you can be sure that your reading is incredibly deep. So I am rereading and loving Moby Dick along with the wonderful community at the Hardcore Literature Book Club. Wuthering Heights, we have Blood Meridian on the horizon, so I'm rereading all of Cormac McCarthy. We've got James Joyce's Ulysses on the horizon, so I'm reading a lot of Joyce. And we have the plays of William Shakespeare, which, like Proust, I am reading consistently pretty much every day of my life. At time of recording, we are preparing for a deep reading of Macbeth. We've read King Lear and Hamlet, and now we're gearing up for Shakespeare's dark masterpiece, the Scottish play. But anyway, let me show you what books I'm enjoying at the moment. Okay, let's start with some beautiful first editions, and we're starting with this reread of George Saunders' debut novel, Lincoln in the Bardo. I picked this novel up the day it came out. I was living in Toronto at the time. I went down to a little independent bookstore and I got my hands on this gorgeous first edition, which I have been trying to protect. It's going to be worth a little bit of money someday, though of course I'm not interested in that. I wouldn't sell it. I think the cover is absolutely beautiful, and I was really swept up in the story. It actually broke my heart. It made me cry in many different areas, and then I put off rereading it for a long time because I didn't want the magic to be broken. I didn't want to realise that perhaps it wasn't as great as I remember. Since then, I have read it a total of 3 times from start to finish, and I have dipped into it many times over, and I'm very happy to say that the spell has not been broken and it still retains its power. George Saunders is a writer to be excited about. He's a writer to be thankful that we have today in our contemporary times, and he's a very special writer. So you should look out for more of George Saunders' stuff. I've gone on to read quite a bit of his stuff. I've also recently enjoyed, well, not so recently, this was last year, the year it came out, his collection of short story masterclasses in book form on the Russian classics. Really, really good read. Lincoln in the Bardo, I'm currently preparing to do a podcast on this. I think it's a very, very powerful book. He utilises a very similar technique to Svetlana Alexievich. It's a sort of polyphonic technique. The prose is absolutely gorgeous. You want to reread it and read it aloud, and it is thoroughly heartbreaking. And as I mentioned, Svetlana Alexievich, I'm also rereading her Voices from Chernobyl. She came to my attention the year she won the Nobel Prize, 2015, and after that I went on to devour her works, though this book and much of what she puts together is not for the faint of heart. And we'll have a podcast on this at some point too. Now, moving on to another first edition, we have Klara and the Sun by Kazuo Ishiguro, and you might have guessed it, this will be a podcast too. Again, I got this the day it came out and I abandoned it halfway through. At first I was excited and then I got a little bit tired with it, and I know many other readers feel the same, but there are a lot of readers who absolutely loved it. And what I found was the subject matter felt really pressing. This felt like the book of our time, and the subject matter began to haunt me. I couldn't quite shake it, and so I had to return to it. And I'm glad I did, because I got so much out of this book, and I think there is a lot to talk about in regards to our next major revolution. We had the agricultural revolution, then the Industrial Revolution, and now we have a machine learning, artificial intelligence revolution. So yes, we're going to have a podcast on this, and not only did I finally derive some enjoyment from this work, but it sent me back through Kazuo Ishiguro's oeuvre. Primarily these three books. We have The Remains of the Day, which I'm thinking may be his masterpiece, it may be his best book. It's a toss-up between that and Never Let Me Go, and of course we have A Pale View of Hills. Now, rapid fire, we'll keep the pace going, and I have expanded my library of America collection with these volumes from Herman Melville. I also picked up his shorter fiction, which I felt was due a reread, but we have here his first and second and third novels, Taipei and Omu, and then we have his poems, his battle pieces, and miscellaneous writings. I'm doing a little bit of an esoteric thing with Herman Melville, and I'm putting myself in the shoes of the first reader. I'm pretending that his first novel came out this year, and I am reading through his oeuvre in real time, so I am forcing myself to delay gratification before going on to his second and third novel. And what I hope to gain from this kind of crazy style of reading is a deeper appreciation of Herman Melville's artistic evolution. I've done something quite similar with Shakespeare, though I haven't paced the plays out in real time. I have read them in chronological order, or what I would designate to be the most likely chronological order. And I must say, I can't think of another way to more fully inhabit a writer and to understand and appreciate what they're all about than this approach. So it's a good one. You might want to consider doing something similar for your favourite writers too. As you probably know, I'm a huge fan of this generation of the Everymans, and here we have Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, which is a bit of a deep reread for me, but a very, very enjoyable one. I've been enjoying flipping through the Canterbury Tales once again, and it's left me wondering why we don't have an adequate audiobook version of the Canterbury Tales. Now, you can find many different audios, and they're of differing quality, but they're not in Chaucer's original language. They've been modernised, which I think is to strip the language of its poetry and its poignance. What a shame. Now, I have found a young man on YouTube who has given some live readings of the works, and he does a tremendous job. He does it from memory, and I think he's done Chaucer a really good service, but even he hasn't done the whole thing. I think we're in sore need, or at least I'm in sore need, of a complete Canterbury Tales in original pronunciation in audio form. This is a project that I may take up myself in the future if there's interest, and perhaps even if there isn't, because this is what I want to see in the world. So sometimes if there is a lack of something in the world and there's something that you want to see, the best thing you can do is go about bringing it into the world yourself. Sometimes you're left with no other option. And I don't think I've spoken in depth about this publishing house, but I'm a huge fan. It's the Oxford World's Classics series, and I've recently had a bit of a haul of these. I've picked up Henry James's The Portrait of a Lady. We have Nathaniel Hawthorne's Scarlet Letter, recently deep diving into Herman Melville's correspondences with his dear friend Hawthorne. I found myself desiring to revisit some of his works too. So we've got the Scarlet Letter there. We've also got Thomas Hobbes's Leviathan, and even though I've read Aristotle and Plato quite extensively, I couldn't help but pick a few of their select writings up, published by Oxford World's Classics. I'm also a huge fan of Robin Waterfield. He's my recommended translator for Plato's Republic, which we will be breaking apart in the book club together very soon. What else do we have? We also have Joseph Campbell's The Hero with 1,000 Faces, and you can see my copy is well and truly battered. I think this is a great textbook for understanding mythology, for understanding religion, but also understanding the journeys and quests that we undertake over the course of our lives. I've had this edition for well over a decade, and it's well and truly loved. I don't think you can get this edition anymore, so I definitely do treasure it. Okay, we've got some really cool criticism here. First, we've got European Literature and the Latin Middle Ages by Ernst Robert Curtius. It's a really, really dense read, and it requires sitting down in quiet with a pen and a paper and dedicating a good few minutes per page, rereading, journaling around it. I think it's a great book. It's very, very challenging, but if you want to understand more about the Western canon, I cannot recommend this or praise this highly enough. It's a really good read. We also have Auerbach's Mimesis, which I first attempted to breach as an undergraduate in my first year at Oxford. Didn't understand it at all. I remember taking it down from the stacks at the Bodleian Library, went right over my head, and it's a delight to find that many years later I do actually understand it and I can wrangle with it valiantly. So it's a good read. Another challenging one, The Representation of Reality in Western Literature. And we have another reread, this time with some Shakespearean criticism. This is E.M.W. Tillyard's Shakespeare's History Plays, and I will be recommending this to book club readers at the Hardcore Literature Book Club. If you're following along with the Shakespeare's Masterpieces lecture series, you know that part of the pre-play prep, where we talk about the story and the characters, the challenges, things to focus on, and so forth, you'll know that there's a deep cut section where I offer you a new play-specific work of criticism to help illuminate the text. We've done that for King Lear so far, and Hamlet. We're getting ready to do that for Macbeth, and this is a really, really good book of criticism, not only for understanding the history plays, but for understanding the Elizabethan worldview, the paradigms of thought, the underlying assumptions of the world and man's position in the world. It's essential reading for getting a lot out of Shakespeare's plays, whether they are history, tragedy, comedy, pastoral, historical, comedic, tragical, or whatever it is Polonius says. We have Cormac McCarthy's Blood Meridian. I don't know how many copies of this I have. I don't know how many times I've read this. This edition is absolutely falling apart. It's stuffed with my lecture notes, and I'm really looking forward to explicating this book and reading it with the Hardcore Literature Book Club. The reads that I've been most looking forward to this year are number 1, Moby Dick, and number 2, Blood Meridian. Also, Clarissa is looming like a Leviathan on the horizon. I'm looking forward to that too. This will be a really shocking one, and many members have said that they feel apprehensive or nervous. They feel a bit sick in their gut because they know the reputation of Blood Meridian, and what I would say is, you might struggle to get through it on a first read. I struggled through it a couple of times, put it down a couple of times before I made my way all the way through, and I think a lot of people say that they had the same experience. It is a bloodbath, but it's worth reading. Cormac McCarthy, like Melville, is a Shakespearean novelist, so reading some of Shakespeare's tragedies, his high banquets of blood, alongside this will be really rewarding. If I had a sudden windfall of money, I would most likely plump for this limited edition of Blood Meridian, which one of the members of the Hardcore Literature Book Club shared with me, teased me with this. I don't think I'll be getting this one anytime soon, but it is absolutely beautiful. I'm envious of anybody who is in the position to obtain this version of Blood Meridian. It's beautiful. So I mentioned that I'm always reading Shakespeare and always reading Proust. At the moment, I'm getting a lot of nourishment from Lydia Davis's translation. As you may know, I'm a huge fan of the Moncrief Kilmartin Enright. It's still my preferred translation, but I can't help but be utterly charmed by this version too. And it really helps take one's appreciation of Proust, particularly as somebody who is not fluent in French. It helps take it to that next level, particularly stacking the translations side by side. That's something that I like to do, and we will do more of. Now, in addition to Proust and Shakespeare, another author that I am continuously drawing nourishment from is Ralph Waldo Emerson. One of the most popular podcasts to date was on Emerson's self-reliance. It was also one of simultaneously the most challenging podcast and the most rewarding. It really forced me to the limits of my cognitive power, and following the podcast on self-reliance, we had a book club audio exclusive to the book club on his essay on history, and we'll have many, many more. I'm a huge fan of Emerson. I can understand why some might not be. You typically do love him or hate him. I think if you read through some of the essays from The Conduct of Life, read Power, read Fate, read Self-Reliance, read his diary entries, read anything that he put out, essentially. Flip through him, open him at any page. You do not need to read his essays front to back, start to finish. You can just open them, and very similar to Marcus Aurelius in that way, you will come across these wonderful lines that you most likely would want to commit to your own commonplace book. So Emerson's great, I'm always reading him. And now I would like to share with you a book that I have been reading for years and deliberately holding off on finishing. Even though I absolutely adore the story, I will not finish it. And I believe that is testament to just how much I adore the story, and that is Eiji Yoshikawa's Musashi. It's one of those books that I have designated to have a sort of scriptural status in my life, so I really relish the few chapters that I allot myself to read every now and then, and I am working at a pace that means I will not be reaching the end for a very long time, and I have been reading and rereading it for a very long time. I know these are peculiar ways to read books, but hey, it works for me, and I get a lot out of my books when I'm playing these games and forcing these constraints upon me. Obviously, members of the book club will know that I'm a huge fan of these constraints. We are currently deep reading Middlemarch according to the original serialised publication schedule. Book 1, Miss Brooke, was published in December of 1871, one of the coldest years on record, which gave way to one of the wettest years on record. And if readers loved that first book, which was around 100 or so pages, they would have to wait 2 months until February to get book 2. And so they would read Middlemarch over the course of a year. And if you follow this reading style, you'll find that the world of Middlemarch has a very curiously lived-in effect. It feels like you are an inhabitant yourself, and you feel as though you know these characters. It's a great way to really live the great books. So if you can obtain the original serialised publication schedule from the likes of George Eliot, Charles Dickens, you might want to think about following it and note down your response. Indeed, let me know how that has helped or hindered your appreciation. I don't believe it will hinder your appreciation. I think today we need to learn to delay our gratification because it is a skill that has started to waste away. Our ability to delay our gratification has atrophied, but there are rewards aplenty, bountiful rewards for those who can do it. Let's talk poetry. A poet that I find myself more and more obsessed with each and every day is Hart Crane. And Hart Crane will most certainly complement anybody's reading of Herman Melville. He's very, very dense, he's elusive and elusive, and he's really, really difficult. He requires multiple readings aloud, and he requires a ton of patience. Here's the final stanza to his poem, To Brooklyn Bridge. He writes, "O sleepless as the river under thee, vaulting the sea, the prairie's dreaming sod, unto us lowliest sometimes sweep, descend, and of the curve ship lend a myth to God." Who else am I deep reading? Well, I'm also preparing for a Thomas Pynchon podcast in which we will focus primarily on The Crying of Lot 49 and Gravity's Rainbow. If you want to talk about really dense and difficult postmodern writers, then we need to talk Thomas Pynchon. So hopefully in the near future we can explicate some of his works, we can go through them together and try to derive some enjoyment from them. I've also picked up Iris Murdoch and Edith Wharton as well. I picked up a nice copy of Edith Wharton from a second-hand bookstore. Iris Murdoch, I'm coming to her in a big way for the first time. I've read her bits and bobs of her before, but never in a particularly big way. I must say that what I'm reading so far, I'm very much enjoying. Talking about rereads, let's talk about Haruki Murakami, and once again, in the hopes of a future podcast, plundering his oeuvre, his hard-boiled Wonderland and the End of the World is what broke me out of a reading slump, a post-university fallow period in my reading where I didn't really want to read any books. I was sick of them by the end of Oxford. And I think that early Murakami is more representative of what he's all about than Norwegian Wood. I might say that Norwegian Wood is one of his best, but it definitely doesn't have the magical realism that he has gained a reputation for. Typically, you will find that you either love the magical realism or you prefer books like Norwegian Wood. Giving a newcomer to Murakami Norwegian Wood can be quite deceiving, because obviously when they go on to read the rest of his canon, they will find that they're not quite comparable. Now, I would like to share with you two books that were very kindly gifted to me by members of the Hardcore Literature Book Club, and I'm very, very thankful for these two deep readers and lovers of literature. The first book is called The Buddha and the Terrorist by Satish Kumar. I've read a little bit of it, but I still need to put aside a block of time to dedicate all of my attention to this one, because I feel like this is going to be a good one. It's also just a very beautiful artifact. It's got the ruffled pages that I'm a huge fan of. And the second gift is Lord Chesterfield's Letters to His Son. We have a dedicated mini video going through this book together, because I think this might be the oldest book I now own. It's quite a charming little artifact, and I must say I've really enjoyed holding it and rifling through it and reading this man's advice to his son. And yes, we're still going. I also obtained a big stack of plays. I'm not going to show you all of the plays that I'm rifling through. We have Ibsen, we have Chekhov, but I really love these Faber and Faber little slim solitary editions. As you may or may not know, one of my first loves was the theatre. I was really, really big into theatre before I came to books specifically. So I've picked up Nick Dear's adaptation of Frankenstein. I believe Benedict Cumberbatch starred in this. I haven't seen it though. Picked up some Harold Pinter, which I must say is much easier to see a Harold Pinter play performed than to read it on the page, but he does some very interesting and one could argue groundbreaking things. We've also got Nick Payne's Elegy, haven't read this one yet, and a version of Ibsen's Ghosts. And we're still going, but I'm going to wrap it up very soon. We've got The Master and Margarita, and I got completely swept up in this narrative. Again, it's got those ruffled pages that I love so much. You'll probably see a dedicated video or podcast on this book at some point. Philip Roth is an author who has been on the periphery of my awareness for a while. A good friend at university did his final dissertation on Roth, and it's taken me a while to get into his works. It wasn't until a member of the book club mentioned doing a deep dive into Philip Roth, I thought, now's the time. So I picked up Sabbath's Theatre. I also picked up Their Eyes Were Watching God by Zora Neale Hurston. Both books I am thoroughly enjoying, and in addition to that, I find myself at the end of every day running my fingers along the spines of the Shakespeares, the new acquisition, and the complete works of Dickens, and just pulling down volumes, dipping into them. I find that to be a really satisfying way to end the day. And with that, let us end this video here. I hope you enjoyed that. Do let me know if any of those books piqued your curiosity. Let us know if you've read any of them, and let us know what you're dipping into at the moment. Are you a monogamous reader? Do you need to read one book at a time, or do you like to dip into several in a single sitting? If so, how many books are you reading? But remember, quantity is not our measure of success. It's about depth, it's about rereading, relishing, appreciating. That's what we really want from our books. Let us know how you read. I hope you have a lovely day, and happy reading, everybody. Bye-bye for now.